Well, I got some photos and some stories and a few little humorous anecdotes this Monday. Hope everything's okay. As I do this, it's sort of gray outside. It's not cold. As a matter of fact, it's like 66 degrees, but we got some thunderstorms trying to come. Spring is here in Alabama. So at least as far as I'm concerned, there may be a cold snap before Easter, but I got a few stories here for you. I hope you'll enjoy these. And one of the things that I really like to cover here is my shop foreman, and I've talked about him before. He was a really good friend of mine. He's already passed on now. He was like 18 years older than I am, and I worked with him for 15 years. But this 7.3 hard start, I'll give you a little technical instruction on that, and I'm also going to talk about something funny that happened. And they threw this job to me because it was, you know, hard to start. It would start, but it was hard to start. It'd spin a little bit long before it would fire up, and you'd spin it for probably 15-20 seconds and it would eventually start up, and it ran pretty decent once it started up. But what the deal was, there's supposed to be 55 to 80 psi on one of these. This one only had 26. Now this gauge I'm holding, you know, there's a special little elbow-shaped adapter that you hook into that Schrader there. You can't just hook your gauge right into it because there's a little spring-loaded adapter that they specially made for that. There's probably some out there now that I don't know anything about, or stuff that people have come up with for checking this pressure. But one way or another, this one here only had like 26 pounds of fuel pressure, and the fuel pressure and the high pressure oil pressure are two different things. This one here that I was actually showing you a picture of was acceptable but slightly low. Now there was a range that it could put up with before it started giving trouble, but when I checked this one, it only had 26 pounds and it was supposed to have 55 to 80, and I said this is going to be the reason for that hard start. And so since I was doing so much drivability work, and it paid like 6 hours to replace that pump in the valley, even though it's not that hard to do, you can do it in about 1 hour and 45 minutes even if you're slow. But that particular day, the shop foreman, he says, hey, I want to give this to this guy over here and let him do it, you know, because you got a lot of other drivability work. I was working out 12, 15 cars a day, you know, and so I was doing a lot of troubleshooting. But he actually put this fuel pump in the valley. That's what the deal was. And now, after he put this fuel pump on it, I mean, I didn't even look at it again after he put the fuel pump on it. They couldn't get it to start at all, and it was puffing out all kinds of white smoke. And they would spin it and spin it and spin it and spin it and spin it. White smoke was coming out the back. And so the shop foreman, he came out of the 1960s, you know, and he had certain preconceptions about some things. And he's pretty sharp about a lot of stuff. I really like the guy, and I'm not trashing him, but he could come up with some funny ideas. But he came over there and he says, why do you suppose this diesel won't start after we replace this fuel pump? And looking at the white smoke coming out the back of it, listening to it spin, I said, it sounds to me like it's flooded. He goes, no, you can't flood no diesel. I don't know what you're... And so I says, well, I guess you just need to figure it out then. So he went back over there, and they spun that starter on that thing. Well, I thought he was going to burn it up, trying to get that thing to start. And finally, he says, come over here and see if you can help us get this thing figured out, because it's not starting. See, the guy cranked it and drove it in there, or started and drove it in there, but after he changed the pump, that's all he did, it wouldn't start at all. Now, I don't know if you know about these power strokes. You don't really have to bleed the fuel system because they're self-bleeding. They got little orifices here, there in the system, so they push the air out automatically, which is pretty cool. But when you're scanning a 7.3 power stroke diesel, there is no PID for fuel pressure because there's no sensor for fuel pressure, and it has no idea what the fuel pressure is. That's why you have to check it with a gauge. The only thing that you have on there that you can look at with a scan tool is injector control pressure. And these PIDs right here were what we were seeing here. But you notice this 65% reading, that's as high as that IPR, that injector pressure regulator, that's as high as it goes. It doesn't go to 100%. It only goes to 65. And when it goes to 65, you're close to topping out 3,600 pounds of control oil pressure to the injectors is the max. Well, this one here was pushing up right around, you know, 3,300 or something. And I said, that ain't supposed to do that. It's not supposed to go over about 1,100 whenever you're starting it. If it's below 750, it will not start. It won't even operate the injectors if it sees less than 750 psi of control oil pressure. Well, the fuel pulse width looked pretty good. Didn't see anything wrong with the accelerator pedal potentiometer. You know, this is the one that had the idle tracking switch and the AP potentiometer on it and all that. But long and the short of it was, when I looked at the scan and I saw that, I knew what was wrong with it. That hard start over a period of time had caused the adaptive learning to work its way up to the point to where it was putting way more pressure in there. See, it still thought it was going to have to run that pressure that high to get it to start because it had become accustomed to that. And so I told Philip, I says, what we need to do is we need to take both batteries loose, you know, completely just take the system out of the loop, take the batteries out of the loop so that this thing will forget everything it has learned. And so I told him, so Eddie, the guy that was working on it, he pulled the battery cables off, and so Philip comes over and he goes, tell me again how you can flood a diesel. I says, well, it fires on compression, so if you put enough fuel in there, it's going to soak up all that heat without lighting off, then it just goes out the back as white smoke. That's what's going on here. And he, for some reason, he couldn't wrap his head around it. He goes, no, 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 and just like that. He was funny as all get out. After about 5 minutes of having the battery cables off, I told Eddie, I said, put battery cables back on now. So we put them back on, and he breathed on that key, and it just started up after you let the glow plug burn, obviously. And even after that thing started up, Philip was still standing there saying, no, no, no. He was still bogged down about that. All right, this one right here is another little funny Philip story. Sometimes whenever he would look around the shop and he was bored and he didn't have anything going on, he would see somebody hanging around over there doing some work, and he wanted to go over there and try to, you know, talk to you about it and give you a little bit of pointer even if you didn't ask for one. So he comes over there where I'm working on his little LTD, and he says, what are you doing on this car? I said, I'm setting a wet float level on that right there. You know, the float is actually snapped in there by a wire, and so you pull the air horn off, you crank it up, and you can see the gas in there, and you're supposed to measure from the top of that air horn, I mean from this carburetor body down to the fuel. Now, there was a bulletin that came out on some of the earlier model 2150 Motorcraft carburetors that said you were supposed to set them on 3/4 of an inch, but I always looked up the specs on those because you could get in trouble like that, and sure enough, this one, that's float level, and you're supposed to bend the float to set it, was supposed to be on 810 thousandths of an inch, which is a little bit more. That's a lower float level than the 750 thousandths that bulletin said. And so Philip said, set it on 3/4 of an inch. And I says, no, I can't set it on 3/4 of an inch because it'll flood, because the little deck that these interior bolted to is lower than that, and it will start to siphon fuel in there and it will cause it to flood. And he was wanting to argue about that because he, in his mind, see, he came out of the 1960s, and he had the idea that once you got something in your head on a particular platform or a carburetor or whatever, that's all you needed to know about that, and that's the only problem it could give, and the same rules applied to all of them. Well, I wanted to sort of get him a little bit confused and see if I could get him off my back so I could finish the job I was doing, because I knew I was doing it right. And I pointed right next to the carburetor. Now this is a heat riser with, you know, vacuum operated heat riser, and the heat riser is there to close off the exhaust on one side, so the heat will go over through this passage that we eventually got EGR out of. It would go across under the carburetor and go out the other exhaust, and that would basically warm up the area around the carburetor so that you wouldn't have fuel condensing there when the metal was cold. So you wanted to heat that area under the carburetor really good. And this particular one, not only did it have that heat riser down there, but right there on the intake next to the carburetor, it had another little valve to shut that off for whatever reason. I didn't know all the where's and whys about that, but I did know that it had that. And that was called an exhaust heat control valve, and this other one down here was called a heat riser, and Chevys and stuff had those in them too. A lot of you guys, older guys, are going to be familiar with that, or if you've studied older vehicles. Anyway, so I told Philip, I said, that 3/4 of an inch rule doesn't apply to this vehicle because it's got an exhaust heat control valve and a heat riser on it, which had nothing to do with the float level, but it confused him to the point to where he figured he would just wander off and let me finish the job without his input, which is what I was after, you know. And so that, I mean, I ran into a lot of situations like that with him. You know, he'd come around, and like I say, I'm not saying he never had the answers, because sometimes he could help you figure out what was wrong with something, and he was pretty darn good at it. And he was an old school kind of a guy, you know. All right, these K cars that belong to the GTE, you know, General Telephone Electric, we actually had a contract on those. Okay, so those Chrysler K car, they owned a bunch of those things, and we didn't have any books on them or none of that stuff. There was no all data back then. We just had to figure out what was wrong. And these things went through a spell where whenever they got a few miles on them, whenever the air conditioner kicked in, the engine would idle really rough for a second and try to stall. It was really an annoying problem, and you could tinker with one of those things and tinker with it and tinker with it and keep trying to figure it out, and it was just a pain. You just work on it. And then he would go drive, he'd go test drive, because he had to test drive all of those behind you to make sure that they were fixed right. But one day he came over there, and I had pulled one in there, and they said when you first started up, when you give it the gas, and this was a different problem, it would stall, and then you'd have to restart it. Well, whenever I started it up, and I saw the choke close, when you tap the gas, the choke would close, and then whenever you would give it some gas, the air coming into the carburetor would pull that choke open, and this is what it looked like on the car. It would pull that choke open, and then the fast idle cam would catch the choke and hold it open too far, and the engine would stall. Then you'd have to set the choke again and start it up and fool with the throttle and all that kind of stuff. Well, the problem was the spring in here was getting weak. And so you notice how these were riveted on there, and they look like pop rivets, And so what I did was I drilled out those rivets on that one, because I knew I'd fixed this kind of thing before on different vehicles. You put just a little bit more tension on that choke spring, and it's enough that that the incoming air won't pull the choke flaps open and make the fast idle cam catch it. So I went ahead and I had this drilled out, and I was working on, and I was going to put screws back in there to hold that when I got done instead of rivets and all that. So he comes over here and he says, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, and I explained what was going on. I said, it pulls the choke open and then it catches it, and then I'm adjusting this choke spring." And so he had this old school thing that on these cars, and he had been involved with quite a few of them. He says, "We've only had two problems on these cars. One of them is timing belt problems, and the other one is too much carbon in the cylinder head. So you're wasting your time. This is not going to fix that." See, he had never run into this before, and so he basically was thinking that the two problems he had seen that were the preponderance of the issues they had were, one of those had to be the reason, and what I was doing was something he'd never had to do for whatever reason on this car. And I told him, I said, "Well, I've got it torn apart here, and I've got all this stuff laying out here. Let me put it back together, and if you're not satisfied with the way it runs, I'll work on it some more." And after I put it all back together, he drove that thing about 4 or 5 times, let it get cold, kept driving it, trying to get it act up, and it never would. And I overheard him giving it back to the dispatcher, saying, "Well, I'm not satisfied with it, but it seems to run just like it's supposed to, Well, I finally figured out from talking to some Chrysler guys up there when I was at a school in Atlanta what I needed to do to take care of this other problem, where when the air conditioner kicked on, the idle would get really rough and it would try to stall. Now, this vehicle had an oxygen sensor on it. It was a feedback fuel system. And so basically you could actually watch that oxygen sensor voltage and get an idea if you were getting rich or lean. It was just a one-wire oxygen sensor that depended on exhaust heat to warm it up to 600 degrees. But what I found out was one of the guys up at the school, and I can't take credit for figuring this out on my own, although I did verify it before I did it the first time. He says that carburetor on the bottom of it, if you'll pull that carburetor out, and you need to blow all the gas out of it so that, whenever you turn any carburetor upside down, it's going to wind up getting all kinds of particles and junk up in there, and it's going to stop a bunch of passages. You're going to have big problems. But if you very gently use your blower to dry all of the gas out of that out of that reservoir, then you can pull the carburetor off and flip it upside down without a problem. All right, so they said flat foul the bottom of that carburetor. And I said, well, I had one I was looking at, it was doing all this, air conditioner kick on, it would almost die, and then it would catch itself. I hooked my my meter pinched into the oxygen sensor wire, and as soon as this happened, that thing would almost completely die. The oxygen sensor would go lean, and I got a little can of carburetor spray, and the moment that thing kicked on, I shot just a little bit of carburetor spray, that base gasket. The base gasket looked just fine, and it looked like it was being pinched enough, but when I shot a little carburetor spray at it, that oxygen sensor stayed up, and it didn't do this. And I said, aha, this is this flat filing that guy was talking about. You notice how long and skinny this thing is? So it basically was it was bowed, and so when I started flat filing it, it got really shiny on each end, and the more I flat filed it, the more it came together until it was nice. And you got to be you got to have a good file, and you got to be really careful when you're doing this. And then you got to blow all of the filings out when you're doing it. It's the best idea. It's a good idea if you can is to pack some grease in there or something like that to keep it from going down in little passages. But whatever you do, or maybe do something to keep that crap out of there if you can. But I don't even know if I did. I think I just blew it out real good and sprayed it with carburetor spray and all to get rid of the little filings. When I flat file that thing and put that carburetor back on there, that thing ran perfect. Well, usually when Philip went to drive one, I would be hiding whenever he got out of it to come back in the shop because I didn't want him to tell me I needed to work on it some more. After that, every time I got one of those vehicles in there with them grumbling about that rough idle, I would flat file that carburetor and fix every kind of a rough idle problem that vehicle had. It was just one of those revelations, where you fight with it for a long time and finally you find the silver bullet that takes care of it. Of course, you had to do it right. Anyway, he commended me later. He says, I've never seen anything make these things run better like whenever you're filing all that stuff off that carburetor does. And so anyway, that's what I came up with on that one. Now this one right here, there he is looking at the computer we had out there that had our shop manual software and stuff like that. Well, Gary, one of the truck mechanics, found a bunch of old laptops like this one here in the dumpster behind the IRS building over there in town. He found 3 or 4 of them things on there where they had just thrown them in the dumpster. Obviously these things were super old and they were just totally outdated. And it had this green screen with this dorky looking fish screensaver on it. And I mean, the resolution of the screen was stupid and ridiculous. But it just did have enough resolution to where the fish screensaver would work. And so we plugged one of those things in and was looking at that fish screensaver, and it actually had the logo on there that said Internal Revenue Service and all that. And it would boot up without a floppy disk. It didn't boot up on that little floppy that you see over there. It actually had some kind of little rudimentary hard drive in it. Now this thing was so slow and so stupid you couldn't do anything with it. And it didn't have any kind of internet connectivity or nothing like that. It was just a crappy old computer. And so Philip, who is something of a conspiracy theorist anyway, he didn't trust the government, and he comes walking up over there when I'm got this thing setting up on the truck mechanic's toolbox, and we were, I was a sort of a computer guy even then. I don't know everything, but I knew a little. So I was standing there with my fingers on the keyboard when he walked up, and he walks up here, and he goes, "What y'all doing over here?" And I said, "Well, we got this IRS computers that Gary found in the dumpster out behind the IRS building." And so I took my fingers and where it said Internal Revenue Service on there, they had a little prompt under there that was just like an empty box. I don't know what you think. I guess if you're going to do a search through the files or whatever. And I typed the shop foreman's name into that thing. And I thought he was going to hit me. He says, "You get my name out of there, you sucker. I ain't kidding. That's not funny." He had the idea, I guess I was going to trigger a tax audit or something. Well, that reminds me of another situation I ran into where I had that Mopar diagnostic system. Some of you guys have an old 286 processor in there. And I hooked a phone line up to it. And it had a big old ringer on that thing. And it would go, blah, 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 when somebody called in on that phone line, or if it was the wrong number that came in. That thing had a big phone receiver on the back of that. It was a machine that was vaguely similar to this thing you see him standing in front of right here. But it was for Mopar diagnostic system, and it was connected to the, it was by telephone, believe it or not, by dial-up. It was connected to Chrysler, and we would use that to download reflashes and stuff like that. But it was right over there close to where I worked and where my buddy Donnie worked. And he had just met the woman that he's married to now, and he went over there. I mean, I actually was leaving, going out of town. I stopped at the credit union where his girlfriend worked, and she said, "How can I get a hold of them?" Now, you got to remember, there were no cell phones in those days. This is a long time ago. And I said, "Well, I know the number to that Mopar diagnostic system machine down there because I'm the one that connected the phone line to it. And if you call that phone, it will ring really loud, because, the phone was actually there so that when you picked up the phone and held it up to your ear, it would automatically connect you to the Chrysler hotline. But somebody could call back in, and that ringer was loud enough to where you could hear it on the opposite end of that shop, and that shop was 100 yards long. And it was real, real loud. The loudest ringer I've ever heard. And so she says, I said, "So what you can do if you want to have fun with him is you can call down there and tell him that you're the IRS, and you're going to do a tax audit on him. So she says, hey, that's cool. So she had her friend who worked at the next teller station. I found out this out Monday when I came back after the weekend that he said that phone rang and he picked it up and he heard this voice that he didn't know saying, I'm so and so with the Internal Revenue Service and we're going to audit your taxes, and they asked him what his name was and all that. And he says, my heart tried to stop beating and I was so shocked. And I says, well, didn't you think it was kind of suspect that this IRS call was coming in on the MDS, Mopar Diagnostic System machine? He goes, how worried about any of that? I was just thinking I was going to get a tax on it. I still get tickled every time I think about that. But anyway, that's I could go on about that for a while. But one way or another, Philip did not want his name typed into that IRS laptop because he just felt for sure he was going to get audited by the tax people, and he wanted to stay on below the radar, Now these parts people, the shop foreman was in the parts room one day. The parts room was a big friendly place. That guy there, his name is Mark. He went to work at the Ford place right after I did, delivering parts, and then he wound up being one of their main parts men. He still works there today. But the shop foreman was afraid of snakes. There was a football player, there was a professional football player that was a local guy, and this guy had lots and lots and lots and lots of money. He had these big Power Stroke diesel, it's expensive mods that he had done to it and all that. But the wacky thing about this football player is he had this big snake. I mean, this was a big boa constrictor, and in the middle of that snake, he was this big around, and his head was bigger than your fist. And he would walk in there, and he'd have that snake wrapped around his waist with the snake's head up here looking out at everybody. I don't know how you train that snake to do that or what he would do if it tried to get away. But he actually was standing out there in the write-up area, and the shop foreman was on the other side of the glass inside the office. And somebody says, come out here and look at this. And when he saw that snake, his eyes got big, and he just about took off running in the other direction, running over file cabinets, because he was absolutely terrified of snakes. And this one here, even on the other side of the glass, scared the daylights out of him. And so he was in the parts room, and he was recounting. He's always like a bantam rooster anyway. He can just tell a story. He's waving his hands around and being real loud and all. And he's really entertaining to listen to. And he says that his dogs had got tangled up in a bunch of water moccasins down there, and he couldn't do anything about getting them out of there, hunting dogs, And so there was these snakes were biting his dogs and all that kind of stuff. And, it was a tragic story for the dogs, but he was so caught up in this story and reliving it and everything that I just stepped out there outside the parts room on my toolbox, and I got a piece of fuel line hose and slid it over his shoulder, and I thought he was going to do a backflip because he was reliving that snake story, and he thought a snake was climbing over his story. Well, one day I had this curly cord drop light, like you see this $50 drop light, test light you bought from Snap-on for a while. They had this long yellow curly cord that was long enough to go from one end of the car to the other. And I could shake that thing and it would sound just like rattlesnake rattles. If you ever had a pair of those in your hand, you could shake or heard them. And this guy right here got creeped out by the sound of that rattling that I did. He get the heebie-jibbies on that. Well, this rude, heavy truck guy who was from, and I'm not here to trash people from up north, but occasionally down here in the south, these people will, and I don't really talk like somebody from Alabama. I sound more like somebody from Texas because that's where I was born. That's where my dad was from, and I picked up his vernacular. But this guy from Ohio or somewhere was working in the heavy truck department. He's a good mechanic, and I used to go eat lunch with him and everything. We were buddies and everything. But he had a tendency to be rude, and smart alecky, and he thought he was smarter than everybody else. And so he came in there one day with his air valve he tried to put on a big truck, and he had put a Allen wrench in there, and it stripped out the pipe plug that somebody had put in the air valve, and so he couldn't get that plug out of there, and he threw that thing on the counter. He goes, I can't get this plug out of there. One of you parts guys need to tell me something about it, because it was a brand new valve he got out of there. I don't know if they ordered him another or whatever. And I says, yeah, I hate those plugs that those things have in them. They're as soft as brass. He goes, this is brass. And I went over and put my magnet out of my pocket, and it went click, and I said, no, it's not. It's a steel plug. And he just sort of gritted his teeth and looked at me. And later that day, he asked me to get under a truck with him on a creeper and help him stab one of them big Fuller Road Ranger transmissions or whatever it was. And I said, some of these things have got, it had that red primer on the metal, I said, some of these things have got aluminum bell housings. He goes, oh, you might have that on some of your crummy little cars, but we don't have any aluminum bell housings on big trucks, which was kind of a dumb thing to say. I got my magnet out and showed him that one was aluminum. He said, get out of here, you stupid magnet, man. Well, his magnet had already proved him wrong twice in a row, you know. But anyway, I didn't dislike that guy, but he was funny. Oh, and one time, here's another old story. You see how you can look through that right there, and you can see all of those shelves in there? Well, I had this big rubber O-ring that went with a Taurus fuel pump, and I was playing around with it. You know how you're playing around with something, stretching on it and all that kind of stuff. And so I pulled it out like a rubber band, and I shot it out of my hand, and it sailed from where I was standing on this side of a counter through that door, and it went into one of those bins up there, and I could see it. I could see it up there. Well, about 2 weeks later, I mean, every time I went in the parts room, I could see that thing up there. Well, about 2 weeks later, I went in there, and I says, I need a fuel pump O-ring for a Taurus, such and such a Taurus fuel pump. And they looked it up, and they said, well, we don't have one of those. I said, yeah, you do. What do you mean, yeah, you do? And I said, look up there. See that in that bin right up there? There's an O-ring right up there, just like what I need. And so they went over there and got it out, and they were totally bumfuddled, you know, because they said, that wasn't even supposed to be up there. I said, yeah, I know, I shot it up there a while back. Well, I went to the hardware store over there, this old hardware store I'd been to a few times over the years, and I wanted a pair of safety glasses, a specific kind of safety glasses like the ones I was wearing, and I decided I was going to get some lenses ground that were prescription safety glass lenses to put in those safety glass frames, and they were really nice metal frames and all. And so I had some that were kind of worn out, and I knew they had those in stock because I had bought those I was wearing there. And nothing ever changed in that old hardware store, I mean, that old warehouse over there. So I went in there, and there's this kid that I had never seen before behind the counter, and I said, I want a pair of glasses, you know, like these. I was holding them in my hand. He goes, we don't have any glasses like that. And I said, yeah, you do. He said, what do you mean, yeah, you do? Because he'd never seen me, and I hadn't been in there in 2 years, but I knew nothing had changed because everything's still dusty back there. I said, if you'll let me behind the counter, I'll go show you where they are. And I walked down about 3 or 4 shelves and turned in there, and there's all these boxes up there. And I pulled one of them boxes out and opened it up, and there was a brand new pair of glasses in there, just like the ones I wanted. And he was totally blown away. If the person doesn't know what's in the inventory, he doesn't need to be talking to customers and saying, we ain't got it. You know, it's just a bad business. Mechanics with no info used to come to this guy. He would get so disgusted with these guys because Gary, the guy that found the laptops, they were always making fun of him because he'd say, I'd come in here and I don't know what year model truck I'm working on or what transmission's in it, but you know, I need a second gear synchronizer or whatever. You know, I mean, it was just kind of funny how that truck mechanic could always come in there with no information and expected to get the right parts. I used to write the part numbers down in a piece of paper in my clipboard. So when I walked into the parts room, I had the part number. I would give them the part number. They'd throw it on the counter. I would carry it back out of there, and I'd be already fixing my vehicle while the other guy was still trying to get him to look up his part. And if it was a part I changed quite a bit, I'd write that down. Or if it was something I thought I might need later. This used Jeep PCM sale was kind of a comical thing. We had to change out a bunch of those things in these Jeep Cherokees because back during the days in the 80s when all this olefin was in the fuel and it was piling up on the valves and it was making them stumble and all that, Jeep, instead of coming up with a way to fix the problem by getting rid of the carbon or you know whatever, just told that they reprogrammed an engine controller. We couldn't reflash anything then because it was in the 80s, and they reprogrammed the engine controllers, and they would give us these engine controllers to put on there that would actually saturate all that stuff on the valve so that the Jeep wouldn't be cold natured. Well, I wound up using a Ford's, after I did a few of those, I said, you know, I bet I could use this walnut hole blasting thing that Ford came up with to fix the Rangers and Tauruses and stuff. And you know, you had to vacuum the walnut holes out of the intake while you were going in there through the injector hole. And I actually did that on some Jeeps and fixed them without replacing the engine controller. Well, we had replaced a lot of those engine controllers, and the parts room didn't want them back because Jeep didn't want them back. And I just had a whole stack of them laying over there, you know, like books on a bookshelf. And this guy went into the parts room needing an engine controller for some reason for a Jeep. And you know, a lot of them had the same part numbers, that Bendix system, you know, that bulletproof thing that they had for a while in the late 80s. And he says it was from 87 to 90, I think it was, or 91. Anyhow, he says, the people in the parts room say that you have an engine controller I can use. I don't want to buy a new one for $600, but they tell me you've got some of them out here and you might sell me one. And I said, yeah, I got some of them over there. I didn't care if I sold them or not, you know. I figured I'd use them for something one day. You never know what you're going to need, right? So he says, what do you want for it? And I said, $125. He said, would you take 100? And I said, $135. He goes, oh my goodness, you're going the wrong way. Would you take 90? I said, $145. He goes, can we go back to 125? I said, sure. So he gave me $125 and I sold him the engine controller. But see, the parts department sent him out there to see if I would sell him an engine controller. That you wouldn't expect the parts department to do that, but they did. This was Robert Lucas. Now, Robert Lucas is a good friend of mine. He worked in the body shop over there. And one day in the body shop, Robert Lucas was looking for a water leak in the trunk of a car. And so the way you look for a water leak, and a lot of you guys have done this, is you get in there where the water is going to leak into, and you have somebody get a hose and you wet it down. Okay, so Robert gets in the trunk of this car and he tells Joe Bob, or whoever the guy is that's working over in the next, on the other crashed car that's being fixed in there. There's a bunch of other places. Big body shop over there, you know. And you can see this really nice DeVilbiss paint booth over here. Anyway, I said, I didn't say anything. I wasn't there. But Robert gets in the trunk of the car, and this guy's wetting it with the hose while Robert's in there with a flashlight trying to see if he can see where it's leaking. Well, meanwhile, and once again, you got to remember there were no cell phones, and somebody calls his buddy that is wetting the car with the hose to the phone. So his buddy goes over there and he gets caught up in this long phone conversation while Robert's still locked in the trunk. And then whenever he gets through hanging up the phone, he's forgot all about Robert. He looks at his watch, he goes, oh my goodness, it's time to go to lunch. So he goes to lunch and leaves Robert in the trunk. So Robert was locked in the trunk for about an hour and a half going, boom, boom, let me out. Eventually he got let out of there. But anyway, that was a funny little thing. And he was a good body man too. I don't know if he's still over there or not, but that was a picture I took of him in the body shop back there. This was the dispatch office over here with some of the mechanics up here. This guy was a trainee. This guy right here has actually worked his way up to where he's a service manager at one of the dealerships now around over there. But this dispatcher in here was a real irritable kind of a guy. You know, yeah, he was a nice guy. I didn't dislike him or anything. But boy, whenever he was in a bad mood, if he went up to that window and you were asking him for something, and he was always scrambling trying to get a bunch of stuff done, and he seemed like he had more to do than he could get done. And he had a board over there with a big old piece of paper on it, and he kept track of who was working on what vehicle. He handed you the tickets for the work you were supposed to be doing and all that kind of stuff. When you walked up there to talk to him sometimes, he would just throw his hands at you and say, "You just going to wait." You know, and he'd say, "Yeah, be in a minute." And I was thinking, this guy would be a lousy waiter. You know, if you ask him, "Do you want to refill on your coffee or your tea?" Somebody said, "Be in a minute." You know, he was kind of like that. But this guy right here, his name was Sean, and I had this little joke virus that I had, my son had shown me, that it was a little smiley face, and when you run this thing, it wasn't going to hurt anything, but it would pull up all of your files, and it had this thing asking if you wanted to replace all of the files on your main hard drive. And then while you're trying to click no, it wouldn't let the mouse get to no, and it would wipe out all those files while your blood was draining out of your face and your heart was palpitating. And then it would come on and say, "Thank God this is only a game." And so I thought that was really, really hilarious. And I let him email it to his roommate. You know, he said when he got home, his roommate grabbed him by the shirt and said, "What, it was wrong what you did to me." You know, I sent it to a few people too, and it scared the living daylights out of them. Scared the living daylights out of me when my son ran it on my computer while I was watching, but it didn't hurt anything. Although you can't run it now because there's virus software won't even let it. It knows it's a joke virus, but it won't let it run. But Dennis was basically the one that, when the computers came around, he didn't like those because he was old school. That guy was 44 years old in 1984. You know, so he was born in 1940. You can imagine how old he is now. He's been retired for a while now. He was my service manager when I went to work at Lincoln in 1984. And well, wait a minute. Let's see. He was 40. He wasn't 44 years old. But 44 years old, I think, or maybe 45 in this picture, and he's a lot older than that now because a lot of years have gone by. But anyway, this was the shop foreman's office, and up these stairs right here, you go to the room where we did our training, and there was a little conference room up there and everything like that. This was my son Matt working at the with me in 1999 at the dealership over there, and he basically worked there in the summer, the year before he graduated from high school, and did a lot of mechanic work and all. And he's a really sharp cookie anyway. He always was, and real precise in everything he does. Well, you see this old Royal typewriter. My brother bought that, and he gave it to me. And I would run my work orders through there, and on the back of the work order, I would type whatever I did on there. Now, the warranty people wanted to know exactly why you did what you did. Like, for example, if you replaced an engine, you couldn't say engine bad, replaced engine, because they'd charge that back, and the dealership would lose a bunch of money. They wanted you to tell them a story. I checked this, these are the readings I got, and I checked this, I checked that. And there was an awful lot of stuff that needed to be on the back of that, and writing all that down was kind of tedious. And I knew how to type really well, so I'd run my work order through that thing, and on the back of that work order, I would type all of this stuff out about what I did, and it was really neat the way it was done. It was easy to read, and it looked real professional and everything. And the Hunter D111 front end machine that the front end guy was using over there, it had a function where you could type stuff on that, but he never used it. And so the service manager was a real gung-ho kind of a guy at the time, and he really, really liked the way that I was typing. Now, he couldn't require everybody in the dealership to type this stuff on their work orders, but he did say that he went to the front end guy, and he told him he wanted to start typing his, since that front end machine had a typing function on it. And so he comes over there fussing at me, saying, now that you're typing all of your work orders, the service manager wants me to type all of mine. And he was just all ticked off about that. And about 3 days later, one of the service writers came out there, and his tie wasn't tied right, or it was crooked or something. I said, my goodness, you're using one of those kind of knots. Let me show you how to tie a better looking knot on your tie. And so, it's hard for me to tie a tie when somebody else says, let me see your tie. So he pulls it off, gives it to me, and I put it around my neck, and I'm fixing this knot on his tie. And about the time I get this tie tied the way it's supposed to be, the front end man, who had just been required to type because I was typing, yelled over there and told me, get that tie off! Which, you might not think that's funny, but I did. Anyway, I still know where that Royal typewriter is, and I could have it back if I wanted it, but I don't know what I would do with it. But I did a heap of typing on that thing, dealer service reports and all kinds of stuff I typed. When I typed the letter and sent it to Ford, I'd always do it on that typewriter right there. This here I was fixing breakfast back in the day. I was our short order cook here at the house because I could get breakfast done really fast for me and the wife, and I had to leave for work by 6:15 a.m. and she took a picture of me one day cooking breakfast and all that kind of stuff. This was me and a friend of mine named David, who is now an attorney. He's a really nice guy, and we worked together. And I see that they got old phones on the wall back then. Anyway, this was back in the 80s and late 80s, and he worked there for a pretty good while. And I got a lot of funny stories I could tell about him too. And there was another service writer that worked out there with him and all that, and it was just a great deal of fun to talk about that. But that's a picture of me and him back in the day and all that. Now this one right here, this fuel pressure regulator replacement, you might remember on these Ford fuel pressure regulators, they got these 3 bolts right here, these Allen heads, and they got this Loctite stuff on them, and they screw in from the bottom to hold that regulator on there. Now, this is not the vehicle I'm talking about. We had, there was some issues with those fuel pressure regulators in the late 80s, particularly on the 5.8 liter engines, because the spring inside the fuel pressure regulator would rust because of mist going in there, and it would rust the regulator housing, and it would also rust the spring in there. And so we were needing to replace all of those fuel pressure regulators. And so, but the guys out there one day, and I don't know if you looked under the hood of one of these late 80s 5.8 liter Ford trucks or not, but they was plumbing for the air management system all over the top of that engine. It was incredible. The 460, it didn't have all that, but that 5.8, that 351 did. And so what I always do in a situation like that is I knew that a T27 Torx bit would fit these, and a Torx bit works better on an Allen if you get the right size than an Allen does. You're less likely to round out an Allen with a Torx bit than you are with an Allen wrench. And these guys were reaching under there with Allen wrenches And one little piece of a turn at a time, they were screwing these out. It was taking them a long time to change one of those because it was all under all that plumbing and everything. And they want to take the plumbing off so you reach under there and feel around, you know. And these a couple other drivability guys at the time, by that time we had 3 of us, and they said, I hate these things. I got one of these things to do, and I just despise this work. It was a program that Ford came out with where all these fuel pressure regulators had to be replaced, so we were doing about 5 or 6 of them a day, each one of us. And I said, I use my 1/4-inch air ratchet to do that. And they went, what? I said, yeah. You know, and I had these little black one-piece Torx bits that weren't very long. They didn't look quite like that, but it was a T27, as I remember. And they said, well, here's one right here. I bet you, I want you to show me how you do it on this one. I said, okay. So I got my air ratchet. I got under there with that T27 Torx bit, and I could feel around. Pop that regulator off. Had it in my hand right there for them, and their jaws hit the floor because they didn't even know. And I said, my strategy is to just see if it will work. If it won't work, you're frustrated and you find another way. But it just so happened, I figured out that I could reach under there, and there was plenty of room for that little 1/4-inch Ingersoll Rand air ratchet, and I could just spin those things right out of there. I could change one of them things in a minute or two. These other guys were taking, 30 minutes or something to change them out. And they all started using their 1/4-inch air ratchets after that. Now, I kept the shop manuals and the TSBs in order. That's another thing that I did. Because of the way that I got paid, I always made sure that I stayed busy all the time. They paid me a certain amount up to, they guaranteed me a certain amount whatever I turned over that. So it was in my best interest to turn more than my guarantee, but my guarantee would carry me when there wasn't a lot of work in the shop, like when the Peanut Festival was in town or something like that. Because we ran 100 cars a day through the shop on the average over there too. Everybody's working out 3 or 4 cars at a time. Well, there was a foreman and another mechanic that was working on a Ford probe electrical problem, and they could not figure that thing out. It had them up against the wall. It was working them over and beating them up. And so they came over there, and Ford would send out, back in those days, they would send out these little, it was a little set of orange stickers, and you were supposed to go to such and such a page in the vacuum and troubleshooting manual or shop manual, whatever, and stick this orange sticker on that page, and that orange sticker would direct you not to use the information on that page, but to go to this special TSB catalog that had an updated schematic for that particular vehicle or whatever. And there was a lot of those things, and whenever I was short on something to do, in part of the time, I would go up in that room above the service manager's office I showed you a while ago, and I would sit there at the table and I would put all them stickers where they were supposed to go. It was a big job. Nobody wanted to do it. The shop foreman didn't want to do it. But the shop foreman, and when I went over there to look and see why they were getting so beat up, because he had me come over and help them, I opened that thing up and there was one of those orange stickers. And I said, did you notice this orange sticker here? Well, yeah. Do you know what you're supposed to do about that? Well, yeah. I said, well, let's go get this book over here. We went and got the book, flipped to the proper page, found the updated wiring schematic that didn't have the mistakes on it that was causing them all that problem, and figured it out in like a minute and a half, and they've been fighting with it for a day. But one other thing about it was, I also, whenever we got these technical service bulletins, every mechanic in the shop, they got a big bundle of these TSB booklet, it looked like a comic book or whatever, and they give everybody one of these. And I started using these big old black binders they had to keep track of mine and keep them all in order. And I had them in order by year model for many years. I mean, I had a big bunch of them. I left all those when I left to work because they basically belonged to the dealership. But the shop foreman was keeping a book like that up there in that room above the service manager's office. But I had them on this shelf right down there by my service bay. And I kept all those books. The scan tools. When I was done with a scan tool, I'd roll that thing up. I'd put it back in the clamshell. I'd close it. And I'd make sure that it was safe from, any kind of contaminants or whatever. Because I always like to put everything back like it was supposed to be. Now this right here is a work order service writer stories. One time one of these work orders, one of the service writers came in there, and I was in the parts room, and I was working on he saw that I was working on a brand new Crown Victoria that had never been sold yet, but it was some kind of a little warranty repair I had to do to it. And he comes walking in there and he says, can I take 3 15-amp fuses out of this Crown Victoria you're working on and give them to the customer? This guy always liked for somebody else to carry the load while he came off looking like a hero, you know. And I was just kind of shocked that he asked me for that. I said, I guess, I mean, you know, what am I going to say? So he went and jerked 3 15-amp fuses. I watched which ones he pulled. I went back to the parts room. His name was Curtis. And I said, Mark, give me 3 15-amp fuses and charge them to Curtis. You know, and he charged him Curtis' number. Whenever Curtis went up to the cashier, went after that customer was gone, he handed him a bill for 3 fuses. He was fit to be tied about that. Where are your radio tools? These guys, whenever the radios on these vehicles, and you might remember in Volkswagen back in the early 80s, they had these little holes in each side of the radio where you stick these little horseshoe tape shaped tools in there, and it unlatches the radio, and you can just pull it out like a drawer. And so it was real easy to do that. And I did not have any of those radio tools, but I got some 1/8 welding rods, and I'd bend them around a 1 1/16 chrome socket and make little, you know, grind the end of them before I did that. And I made radio tools for myself. And so whenever these service writers, who were always pulling radios for people that came in that needed their radios pulled out and sent off for repair, they would come and get my radio tools. And it was annoying to me, a little bit of an irritant, you know, so I got some welding rods, old welding rods that had cracked flux on them that were, you know, just basically being used for whatever. And I used the wire wheel to get all that flux off there. And I made 3 sets of radio tools for the service writer. Each one, I handed each service writer, here is your own radio tools, you know, so that I wouldn't get irritated at them coming to get mine. Every single service writer lost the radio tools I made for them and came back wanting to borrow mine again. This is the kind of stuff, I could tell you a zillion stories like that. Finally, I moved the radio tools to a different drawer where they couldn't find them, and they had to figure out some other kind of way to deal with that. Windshield won't separate rain from water. That was actually put on a work order. I don't know what that meant. It was crazy as all get out. It had something to do with the way the wipers were working. But the guy was typing faster than he could think. Windshield, what do you do with something like that? You missed a recall. There was a little deal going where the service manager said if, you know, they would print out this online automotive service information system printout on every car that came in, and if there was any kind of recalls or programs on that car, you know, Ford was requiring those to be done, and they would penalize you if a car came in for service, you know, and they had a record of it, and you didn't do a recall on it, then you get smacked by Ford for that because you needed to do it. So the service manager had them print one, and he actually told the service writers, he says, if you miss a recall on this printout that you attach to the work order, and the mechanic catches it, then I'm going to make you give them $1 for every time that happens. And so I went out there one day, and this guy, Dick, was one of the service writers. I said, you missed a recall on this one. No, I don't think so. You know, and he put his cigarette in his mouth, and he's over here fooling around trying to go through the paperwork and all that kind of stuff. And he kept looking and looking, and I says, you can stop looking because you missed the recall. He goes, well, how do you know when I've got all the paperwork out here? See, he had the idea that he had evidence that the recall had already been done. And this particular recall, it was like a program really, which is the difference. But a program runs out of miles in time, but a recall is actually forever. And they had us putting these battery boxes on these Explorers because the battery was getting too hot and boiling over and causing acid problems. So we had put this battery box on them, plastic battery box, to insulate the box to keep the battery from getting so hot. A lot of, you know, vehicles come with battery boxes on them to prevent engine heat from boiling the battery. And anyway, he says, well, how do you know that the recall hadn't been done? I says, because it ain't got no battery box on it. He goes, ooh, busted. Well, one day I was talking to Philip Johnson, the shop foreman, and I said, you know, he was having to drive every car, you know, to make sure that they were all fixed before we turned them in and all that for a while. And he says, I says, what they're doing, what they call the job you're doing here is quality control. He said, he really liked the sound of that. So he had a sticker made, a stamp, so that whenever a vehicle came back in for work, that it was, the mechanic believed that it was, they thought the mechanic might not have fixed it right or didn't do all the work or whatever. They would stamp this big QC, and it had some lines under it explaining, you know, who had worked on it, and they would also have a place for the shop foreman to sign it after get through driving it. And these service writers dearly loved stamping these QC things on these tickets. Mechanics would get angry about it because a lot of the time it wasn't their fault, or even if there was fault, they still didn't like it. And so one day, whenever Dick made a mistake when he was writing the work order, and it was a blatant mistake that he had made, I got a sticky note and I stamped that thing QC, and I put Service Advisor QC. And I took that thing out there and I threw it on the service advisor's desk, and I said, I got a Service Advisor QC for you. And he viciously jerked that sticky note off, wanted it up, threw it in the trash. He was infuriated about that. And it was kind of like a turnabout was fair play, you know. He did not want anybody putting a QC on him, but he threw it on everybody else all the time. And that was what that one there was about. All right. I taught this guy right here. He was the guy that was standing there earlier that I said was an intern, and he's a service manager now. We would run into situations now and again, you know how sometimes it's hard to get. Now they got these flip charts now where you can get just about any connector you want if you're willing to pay $90 for it. But they would have this situation where this wire connector would be damaged, where it, you know, plugs in really neatly to the alternator or whatever, be right up on top where it's easy to get to. And you couldn't get the connector, so we would have to order the whole harness. Well, we tell the guy that owned the car, on this job I'm thinking about, I says, we're going to have to order the whole wire harness because we cannot get this connector by itself. And the cars were so new, there wasn't anything in the salvage yard with a connector on that like that. So that guy said, okay, well, go ahead and do that, you know. So we ordered like a $250 wire harness, and it went all over the engine. And this guy that I was training, I says, what we're going to do is we're going to put this wire harness on there because the guy's paying us to put it on there. He's paying for the wire harness, and we're not just going to clip the connector off and solder it on the existing harness. And I says, because that's what integrity is about. This guy's paying us a lot of money, and we're going to earn the money. We're not going to cheat him by just changing that one connector and making him pay for a whole wire harness that he won't ever use for anything else. Now we can save the old wire harness and snip all the connectors off of it, and I did that. A lot of that old bucket full of wire connectors. It was all different kinds. Anyway, later on, after I went to teaching, I went back over there, and this guy was right there, and he was putting a wire harness on this Expedition because of the fact that he had to replace the whole wire harness because he said you taught me about integrity, and I decided to replace the whole wire harness instead of just putting a connector on there. It was exactly the same situation. So you try to make a difference as much as I can. This was a funny little story. I knew this truck mechanic I've told you about in previous one, big heavy set guy with thick glasses and a beard, you know. And he also had a kind of a weak stomach, you know. And I couldn't have set this up if I tried. So he walks by where Donnie has got this Pepsi bottle, and it didn't have this much in it. It was about half full, and it had a little bit of foam on the top of it. And Donnie would take these Diet Pepsis and shake them up to make them flat, and then he would drink them flat. I've known other people that did that. I just couldn't live like that. But something else that Donnie also did was he chewed this twist chewing tobacco, and he usually had a bottle sitting around that had tobacco spit in it. And the tobacco spit, you know, and the Pepsi looked kind of alike. Now this ain't going where you think it is, just bear with me. So it was right there by the parts room, so he walked by there and happened to be standing there, and he says, what is that? And he points at this bottle with this foam stuff on the top of it. It's about, you know, it's got about that much in the bottom of this bottle. I scratched my head. I said, I don't know what that is. I think it kind of looks like it may be Donnie's tobacco spit, you know, because it was the same color and the brown foam on the top. I know you've seen that before. And so Donnie didn't even know what we were talking about. He walks by, he picks up this bottle and takes a swig of it, and I thought Philip was going to throw up. He turned green and was stumbling into the parts room. That was just one of those things. You couldn't have set it up if you'd have tried, you know. All right, this Terry was this guy that was a big old stump of a boy. He was about 20 years old, and I bet he weighed 300 pounds. His arms were like this big around. You know, he was just naturally a big old guy. And he had this Ranger out there, and he was working on this Ranger. He had the door panel off, and he was having to reach his big old arm up in there to try to get to the door latch. And the customer was waiting on it, and the customer was grumbling at the service writer and said, I don't know why this guy's taking so long to fix my truck. Well, it wasn't an easy job anyway, and besides that, when your hands are as big as the Incredible Hulk, you have trouble getting up in there, you know. And I was standing over, and I was, you know how you happen to hear from a distance this conversation and you see things play out. And so this guy that was talking about the truck, that owned the truck, was talking to the service writer. He said, I bet I could probably go out there and box that guy's ears and make him speed up a little bit. And so Levi, the service writer at the time, says, well, going out there. He's working in that first stall over there. And so I said, I'm going to see how this plays out, because Terry, the guy that was working on the truck, he probably outweighed that guy 60 pounds. You know, this guy, I thought he was a big old tough football player kind of a guy. And he walked over there where Terry was, and he stood there for a minute, and Terry looked at him, and they said something, and then that guy went back to the write-up area. And so I went over there where Terry was, and I says, Terry, what did that guy say to you? He said, I don't know what he wanted. He just stepped up here, and I looked at him and said, can I help you? And he goes, hey, how you doing? And then he went back to the write-up area. You know? He didn't expect to go out there and find a guy that outweighed him 60 pounds working on his truck, and his tough guy image disappeared at that point. This air horn thing, the heavy truck mechanic that got sick when he thought Johnny was drinking tobacco juice, gave me a set of air horns. Actually, it was just one air horn, but it was similar to this. It came off one of them big trucks he was working on, and it was an old rusty one, but it still worked. And I screwed an air fitting in the bottom of it and got the air valve that he had took off the truck, because he replaced the air valve in the horn, gave me the air valve in the horn, and you could plug an air hose into that thing, and I would hold it up at lunchtime and pull that trigger, and wham, that would be lunchtime, see. So there was a guy that was working lowering his lift, and it was getting close to dark, and there was a truck coming by outside. It was a semi-truck, and it had a yellow beacon on the top of it, and it was coming by and getting closer and closer. It was going by the building, but it sounded really loud coming in those doors. And this guy that was the other drivability guy was facing the opposite direction, and he actually was letting his lift down. And so she's letting the lift down, and my helper Larry Sellers put that air hose on that air horn, and he went sneaking up behind this guy that was letting his lift down. Well, in the mind of the guy that was letting the lift down, this truck sounded like it was getting awfully close, and he decided he was going to look around and see where it was, because he could see the beacon that was rotating, hitting the pipe right above his head. And so I saw what Larry was going to do, and I yelled, look out! And Larry goes, wham, blew that horn right behind him. That guy's knees buckled. He just about went all the way to the ground. His eyes glazed over. That was one of those funny little moments that you just about had to be there to appreciate the full comedy of that thing. Well, anyway, this was the long story session. You know, just funny little stuff, and got a little bit of technical jargon I shared with you, and a few little pointers. But I really appreciate you guys watching the videos, and I'll see if I can have you something to chew on next time. I appreciate you being here.